Hello. Wanted to continue our study of architecture, but I wanted to do it through this green screen to try to make architecture come alive. So one of the questions that most likely you will get after this class is what makes architecture good? And despite being like art, something that is very subjective, there is a lot of patterns that you can identify in most of architecture. So one of the things is that it's very important to know that we'll be seeing time after time is what Vitruvius said, that every great architecture has to have three things: utilitas, veritas, and firmitas. Basically what he's saying, every great architecture has to have an utility, a function, has to have firmness, a way to stand, and it has to have beauty, combining humanity, science, and art, and saying a great architecture has to have all of this. So if you're ever asked, why is this architecture good? Just try to say, well, according to Vitruvius, it has to have all these three, and you'll probably sound really smart, and you'll actually be right using those three as the standard, which have been used throughout ages by many architects. Something else that is very important to understand is the means, the motive, and the ability to create a design. But the will, it's something that's very important. Is the desire, what is the will, what is pushing this architecture to be created? So you can see that maybe your house is created simply because you want to have a place of dwelling, a place of refuge, a place that you can call your own. But maybe the design itself is kind of an expression of your own personality. Or you can see many churches, tombs, and different buildings having a specific purpose. And you can see how philosophy, how religion, and all of these things are kind of interacting to create this building. So when you see a building, one of the questions that most likely you'll ask yourself, or you'll see being very recurring throughout the semester, is why is this being built? Why was this built? And most likely, the answer is behind this: the will. What was the motive? What are they trying to do? Is it religious? Is it just simply structural? Is it simply to do something? What is the reason behind it? A lot of the buildings that we see even nowadays, I love sharing the story of how if you really Google the tallest buildings in the world, some of them are taller than the other one just by a couple of feet. This is because they want to, in a way, compete and saying, hey, now I am the tallest building. So that was part of their motive that kind of pushed them to designing this building. Or maybe sometimes one of the reasons they build vertically and high is because there's no space surrounding it. So the motive, the will behind it is really a big factor. So when you're looking at architecture, look, what is the reason behind? Ask yourself, why was this being built? The second thing was the means. It's what is something that you're going to see very recurrent is the materials being used. What was the things that they used? And most likely the answer to all of these questions is whatever is nearby. If in that area there was very predominantly wood, then most likely they used wood. If there was stones and big stones, and they most likely used that. And so as we continue through the story, you start seeing how people start using at their disposal what they have. The materials, the stones, the clay, the fire. As fire starts to become predominant, they start mixing materials. So basically the means is what do they have at their disposal. And even as we go further on, we won't get to that in this class, but when you start seeing the use of steel and stronger materials, that's what they have at their disposal. So why are they building, and what do they have to be able to build it? And the last question is, do they have the ability? Do they have the way to make it work? As we understand in class, most architecture, it has to have the ability to, as Vitruvius said, to withstand, to be firm, to have stability, to be able to not just be built for a couple of days, but to be able to stand generations. And as many of the buildings we see, they do stand. So what is the engineering behind it? What is the math behind it? What is the type of construction that they use? And that's when we start seeing things such as posts and beams, columns, corbelling. We start seeing arches, we start seeing domes, we start seeing all these structural ideas to kind of to maintain a building in place. So when you start seeing through class, just keep asking yourself, what is the motive? Why are they building this? What are the materials? What is the means? How are they going to be able to do this? And second, how are they Do they have the ability? What's holding this into place? Now that we have that in mind, let's continue with the beginnings of architecture. So let's go way back. Urban settlers, they didn't have a permanent settlement. So what they did is that wherever food was, that's where they would go. Maybe you've seen the movie Ice Age, and in the movie there's this mammoth, and the people would sort of follow them around wherever. If they moved to another area, that's where they would go. So they would stay in a place, they would have a settlement, and they would simply keep moving. So they would live in caves, they live in different places, but they never had a permanent settlement. And this is really interesting when we see this cave in France, which is one of the oldest expressions that we have of any kinds of writings or drawings. So this cave in France, you can see depictions of hunting, or maybe there's all these different images that even historians are still trying to really understand what it was. And the truth is, we'll never really know what it was, but believes that it's just depictions of people hunting, or maybe even religious activities. But most likely it was some sort of depiction of hunting, which is where we get our idea and understanding of what Neolithic periods was. Then we continue going into the Mesolithic until we finally get into the Neolithic, which simply means the new Stone Age. And this is a time when settlers, they transitioned from being able in caves and moving around to finally understanding and being able to create settlements, to be able to create a community. They gather around fire and they started farming and creating their own crops. So now, by having this ability to have crops and maybe keeping small herds of sheep and cattle, they could stay in one place. And by staying in one place, they started building, they started creating settlements. They started creating a place that they could live. And that's when the development of permanent dwellings started to arise. Most likely these settlements were either near a river or near a place where the crops could be fully supported throughout the year. And so throughout this time, throughout the Neolithic period, we start seeing the manipulation of construction. And one of the greatest things is called the Stonehenge. And the Stonehenge is simply this big stones that were created and moved many miles, and to create this, what many people are saying is to study the stars. I kind of imagine it as a way as if SpaceX or NASA had needed a place to study science and study the stars the way they have in Houston and Florida. That's something that they did so that they could study the movement of the sun, and they study the stars and the constellations. And so, but something that is incredibly important to understand from Stonehenge is that these stones, again, we have to ask ourselves the questions. Why was it built? And then again, most likely we'll never have the true answer, but that's when we start understanding, okay, most likely it was to study the stars. It's some sort of astronomical clock or something. And then we start understanding, okay, they have the means. What did they use? And they start seeing all these different stones that were not from a nearby place. They were from Wales. And these stones, they weigh tons. So imagine being able to move them and be able to transport them. And not only that, as you can see in some of them, they create some sort of post and beams, as post and lintel, so just columns and beams. And they start creating this sort of way. And again, how did they put them up? But you start seeing a pattern. Another pattern that we mentioned before was the axis. You start seeing the axis. And the axis sort of is trying to point you to a center. And it's trying to point you, what is the center of Stonehenge? And so if you see this aerial view, if you see an aerial view, you start noticing there is some sort of pattern. There is some sort of center to it, which sort of guides your eye to being the most important thing in the whole Stonehenge. So Stonehenge, we start seeing how people are trying to be creative and are trying to create something even with what they have, and already understanding the concepts of posts and beams and the columns and beams and post and lintel, and to manipulate and to create something that they could use. As mentioned before, the idea of now that settlers can create a community because they are able to farm and have their own plants and their own food that they could just cultivate, they start creating settlements. And one of the oldest and examples of this is Chatalahuk. And Chatalahuk, you see these settlements, and it's a very, very interesting example of this community. In this community, there's sort of stepping stones, and they're all very tightly closed. There's almost no streets. Everything is sort of all connected. All the houses are connected. Another thing that's very interesting about this is that the entrance is through the roof. So there's a big opening on the end on the top with the ladder. And so the way it's believed is that the people that lived there, they would go through the top and then go through the stairs, and they would go into the dwelling. And inside, most likely it shows that they had a fire, and this fire was under the hole. So when they would start fire, the smoke would simply just go above the thing. Inside of this Chatalahog, you start seeing a lot of different artwork that sort of survived. A lot of it has been reconstructed and kind of just reimagine how it would be. But there's all these stones and this bones and this sort of sculpture-like that people start believing that they were simply maybe altars or things that they would, some sort of religious connotation that they had inside of these buildings. Something that's also very, very important to start noticing that as we continue, we'll see this how it differs in other communities, but there seems to be no real sign of social levels. There's no, maybe there was some sort of priest, maybe there was some sort of king, but the dwellings do not reflect that. All the homes, all the dwellings are very similar in size and shape and size. So there's no real sign of who was the social hierarchy, which is something that is very interesting to show. Something else that is interesting to understand, again, if we're asking ourselves, why are they building this? Again, ask yourself every single time that question, why are they building this? And most likely you'll see that this is not a city that they're trying to be fortified. Later on, that's going to be a pattern that we see very recurring. As we know, in those times there was a lot of war, there was a constant movement of power. But in this time, there was simply most likely a community that started planting, started living there, and just wanted to have a permanent place of living, a very nice community, but not really afraid or not really in search of fighting or really fearful of fights. And so again, just going over this, there was no street, so everything was the roofs was their ways. Basically, the roofs became their streets. So I could even imagine that at night or walking, they would just sit on the roofs and just simply talk to their neighbors or something like that. Or I could even imagine if you could hear people walking at night or something. I don't know how exactly it was, but it was definitely way better than living in a cave or tent, as how they had been living for a while. Other great Neolithic era building is the ziggurat in Ur, the city of Ur. And the word Ur means primal or origin. And that basically, because it's so old, it's basically the city of origin. So it's trying to show you how old the city is. And the ziggurat is also a great example of how they started manipulating the materials that they had at hand. Nowadays, a cigarette, if you Google the cigarette of Ur, most likely you'll find an image like this. But nowadays, it's so eroded that it's really, really hard to know how it would really have looked like. Some things that you can really see is the axis, the way that there was entrances to this structure to different sides. Another one that kind of very similar to the Stonehenge was the Newgrange building, which is a tomb. And this build is this mound of that just serves as inside. There's this bones of people that they would bury. But again, in this moment, it happens when the summer solstice, the sun hits it. Every summer solstice, the sun comes down at a specific spot that allows the light to come in and just hits it right at the entrance, going all the way the light to where the bones would have been buried. Again, people are so amazed at how, despite of the lack of science advances and all of it that they have, they managed to do this. So we're starting to see how in this time they're starting to understand materials. They're starting to understand the way that they're being guided. Not they're being guided by dwellings, by having a place to live, but also such as a cigarette, such as the Stonehenge, such as the Newgrange, a place that somehow connects us to a greater understanding of the world, a greater understanding of what's going on around them, which kind of takes us to the pyramids. The pyramids are probably one of the most iconic pieces of architecture that you've seen. Most likely, everyone wants to see them someday. I haven't yet gone to see them, but it's definitely on my list to go and be able to see them in Egypt. And this, what is interesting about this is that they go through different periods. Is that Egypt goes through three time periods: older ancient Egypt, Middle, and the New Kingdom. And these three periods were really very different. The one that we see the most, that is more familiar, is ancient Egypt. This is the time where most of the construction really happened. And this, it happened in different phases. Normally, we just recognize the three great pyramids of Giza, but it actually has started happening with different ways. Actually started with what they call the matabas, which basically means a table or a flatbed. And so when you see these type of pyramids, they're basically just starting, curve, very rectilinear, and then sort of flat on the top. And these were the first types of pyramids. And then they started evolving into was the step pyramid. And this is one of the most famous ones as well, and because it was very revolutionary. It was something that it was a great big step. And it's very similar to the Matamba. It just simply kind of started layering, something very similar as we've seen with the cigarette, or even with the shatalach. That's how there were different levels all around it. So you start seeing this sort of common architecture being resembled in different ways. And then the second one, the step pyramid, was as the pharaoh was so impressed and so thankful that he even took his own architect, the architect of that pyramid, and took him with him to the tomb once he died, in a way of elevating him to the status of deity, saying now he will spend eternity with me. So that was a great accomplishment for the architect. Eventually, the next three pyramids that are erected they learned from what they did in the past. There's another one that is a bit more curved and also in there, but the ones that are most impressive are the three pyramids of Giza, which are called Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, and they're about 760 feet high. And one of the questions is, you start asking yourself, how was this constructed? How did they have the means? So one of the things that we know about it is that it took about 75,000 skilled workers, more than 3,000 unskilled workers, and most likely they were moving things through the water and to move materials through the water. Something that's very important also about this is that they use what is called a knotted rope of 12 sections to make a triangle. And this was a way that they would use for geometry, to have some sort of measurements. So everything that the Egyptians is really to work with geometry and grids, and to having some sort of standards of proportion, some sort of grid. Something that is very important about the Egyptians is that in most of their artwork and most of their sculptures, something that's very common is that it's something called that they were very static. They were always very static. And another thing was that they were uh, it was more important to reflect the spiritual side rather than the natural. They wanted to be able to reflect their spiritual side, what they believed in, what they were really believing in the supernatural, rather than in the naturalistic. So they were all the people that they were creating, the shapes and the designs were not really trying to exemplify how they really looked, but more about how they were being represented spiritually. So spiritually, their beliefs in the afterlife. There's even a book that they call the Book of Dead that some people find later on, and they're able to decipher. They find this called the Rosetta Stone, and I don't know if you've used that I think it's a software where you can learn a new language, and it's called Rosetta Stone. But there's actually a Rosetta Stone that they find, and it's divided into three parts. The bottom part is Greek, and the middle one is it's a variation of Greek, and then the top one is the Egyptian language. And there was this person who was able to understand Greek, this French historian, and is able to translate it, and is able to translate this into the language to be able to understand. And through one of those things that he found was this Book of Death, and understanding how their body goes, where it ends, where it goes after their life, his life ends. So it's important to understand. The great importance of these pyramids were to house the pharaohs, and to house them, to have these catacombs, to have these tombs, these chambers that the pharaohs can live eternally, that their spirit, that their soul can somehow find a vessel that they can live on forever, and they can rule in the afterworld. And what happened also very many times was that different people were starting to rob the tombs. People were starting to loot these tombs. So architects and the people designing this pyramid starting to create different ways and different labyrinths in a way to trap or to stop the people from stealing all the things that the pharaohs were being um, buried with. The last period is what we call the New Kingdom. And this is the Middle Kingdom sort of comes with a lot of fights and a lot of problems, but the New Kingdom is one of the things that kind of lasts the longest, but eventually ends. And this is it's known for many different pharaohs that take place around this time. One was even a woman, and it's a very interesting story how this woman she's depicted, or she depicts herself as a man. She kind of dresses up like a man in order to have the legitimacy that in those times would only be given to male pharaohs. But later on, one of the last pharaohs is Ramses II. And the reason why he is so important is because Ramses II, he lived to be 90 years old. And he had 100 kids or more. I don't around 100 kids, but even though he had 100 kids, he still outlived most of his 13 oldest kids. So he lived to be the longest, even for those times. He was documents said that he lived for such a long time, and having reigning for 67 of those 90 years. And so it's because he lived so long, he got to really push and really do a lot of work. So a lot of the things that we see nowadays in Egypt are led by his design, or led by his during his ruling. After him, many other Ramses the second, third, fourth, fifth came on, and it was this period where they were just keeping moving forward, but eventually it all ended and leading to a new era, which we'll be covering in the next topic.